Hey everybody, thanks for joining me as we continue our educational journey. This is the third lecture video for Unit 8. Today we're going to talk about a phenomenon known as bioaccumulation and biomagnification to answer questions like what happens when toxic pollutants enter an ecosystem, how do they impact aquatic organisms, how do they change throughout aquatic ecosystems, and most importantly, why children should not eat tuna fish. So take a look at this chart. And it says that kids under 6 should be eating tuna, white tuna, at most once a month, light tuna at least, or at most 3 times a month, right? For older kids, it's a little bit different, right? And they're saying consume responsibly. You might be thinking, well, why can't I have tuna? Why can't I feed tuna to my kids? This is ridiculous. Well, chill out, Karen. Everything's going to be fine, okay? There's a reason that you shouldn't feed tuna to your kids, and that has to do with the mercury levels within the fish. High levels of mercury are commonly found within tuna, and if you consume too much of that, right, it can build up in your blood and lead to some pretty substantial health side effects, right, including the following, all which are symptoms of mercury poisoning: muscle weakness, poor coordination, numbness in the hands and feet, skin rashes, anxiety, memory problems, trouble speaking, hearing, seeing, reproductive nervous and circulatory system issues. The list goes on and on. Historically, mercury has been used in the making and the construction and preservation of the materials used to make hats, which is why the Mad Hatter is in Alice in Wonderland. Why that character is even a thing is because there was this general trend that people who made hats, you know, back in the early 20th century would tend to get mercury poisoning due to exposure to the chemicals used to make the hats and go crazy. So the Mad Hatter is a sort of a caricature of that pattern that we saw. So mercury is bad. You don't want to be exposed to mercury. It's a heavy metal. And now you might be wondering, Karen, why there is mercury in your tuna fish. Well, okay, chill out. Let me explain it to you. Please put the spoon away. It's very threatening. First of all, it's not just mercury. It's something called methylmercury, which is a mercury atom with a methyl group. Methyl referring to methane, which is CH4. In this case, a methyl group is CH3. And it's converted from mercury by aquatic bacteria. And methylmercury is found in tuna fish because of 2 processes, the 2 I named at the top. Bioaccumulation, which is the buildup of a toxic substance in organic tissue. As they continue to eat that substance, it will build up in their tissue. And the fancy definition is the selective absorption and concentration of elements or compounds by cells in a living organism, most commonly fat-soluble compounds. That's the fancy definition, so I used my fancy voice. The other reason that there's methylmercury building up in tuna fish is because of biomagnification, which is this idea that toxins that are built that build up in an organism's tissue will actually grow exponentially as you go up the trophic level, as you go up levels of the food chain. Fancy definition of that: the increase in concentration of substances per unit of body tissue that occurs in successfully higher trophic levels of a food chain or in a food web. Okay, so bioaccumulation and biomagnification. They're similar but slightly different, and let's see if we can piece them apart. Bioaccumulation is the buildup of contaminants within an organism's tissue over time. For example, dolphins, mercury will build up in their tissue over time due to exposure. Whereas biomagnification is this idea that, let's say we've got shrimp that contaminate is slowly building up in the shrimp, and we've got a dolphin that is eating a bunch of shrimp. So all of the contaminants that have built up in the shrimp, say a dolphin eats 30 shrimp a day, all of those contaminants are going to end up in the dolphin. Right, and then let's say a sea lion eats 2 dolphins. So all of the contaminants in those dolphins are going to end up in the sea lion. And let's say a polar bear eats 1 sea lion a week, right? That's going to cause all of the contaminants in the sea lion to build up in the polar bear. And so top carnivores are going to be most impacted. And the higher the food chain, the longer it is, the worse off it is because it builds up exponentially. right? Here's another diagram showing a similar thing. Bioaccumulation is the buildup in an organism's tissue. Biomagnification is the exponential increase with trophic levels. And tuna fish are at a very high trophic level. They're close to the top of their respective food chain, which means that methyl mercury will build up in their tissue not only through bioaccumulation, but also through their consumption of other fish, which have consumed other fish, which have consumed animal plankton, which have consumed phytoplankton. So there is a constant buildup of methyl mercury throughout this food chain that all culminates in the tuna fish. So all of the methyl mercury absorbed by all of the plant plankton ends up in the tuna ultimately, which is a lot concentrated in one organism, which is why tuna can be dangerous for especially children to eat because their bodies are small and they're still developing. But it's not just tuna, and it's not just mercury. Those are the examples I give because that's probably the most common one that you may have heard of before, but it doesn't have to be mercury. It can be any pollutant that is persistent, right? And those are classified as with the term persistent organic pollutant, or POPs. And when you think of POPs, you're probably thinking of these things, but that's not what we're talking about, okay? We're talking about persistent organic pollutants, which include things, a couple examples I'll give in a minute, like DDT, PCBs, and PFOAs. So persistent organic pollutants are dangerous because they're synthetic, they're carbon-based, and they don't break down easily in the environment, which means they're persistent and they last a long time. They're organic because they're carbon-based, but they do dissolve in fat. So as organisms consume them on accident or because they're consuming other food or they just get exposed to them in their ecosystem, that's going to allow these chemicals to accumulate in their fatty tissue where it will build up and become toxic doses over time, right? A small dose, a small exposure to POPs is not necessarily going to harm the individual, but over time, chronic exposure can build up in the tissue and do substantial damage. And additionally, a lot of these things can be picked up by wind and carried long distances, or by the water, carried far from the initial source. So these things can spread far and wide. Let's go through a couple examples. The first one is one we've talked about before, DDT, which is a carcinogenic pesticide used throughout up until the 60s. It causes cancer. That's what a carcinogen is. And it was brought to the attention of the American people by Rachel Carson, who is an environmentalist and a writer who published her book in, I want to say 1963. DDT was then banned by 1973. And it can have really substantial impacts on top carnivores, like I mentioned, in many predatory birds like raptors, like hawks and stuff like that. Their eggshells will be thin, it can have reproductive malformities, and it can just straight up kill them. Another example that you may have heard of are called PFAs or PFOAs, also known as C8. This is one of the chemicals that was used to develop Teflon, which is the nonstick coating on many pans. So that's why you're not supposed to use metal utensils on a nonstick pan, because if you scrape that stuff off, you will end up ingesting it and it can cause cancer. Unfortunately, PFAs and PFOAs have been so poorly regulated but so widely distributed through a variety of products, including things like Gore-Tex, that it's actually, if you they've tested blood from people all around the world, some who've never even used these products, and they find traces of PFAs in almost everybody's blood across the entire world. So it's extremely pervasive, and if you can, try and move away from nonstick pans. If you want to learn more about this, there's an amazingly fantastic and jarring documentary available on Netflix called The Devil We Know, and there's a movie starring Mark Ruffalo called Dark Waters, which is based on this story. I find the documentary actually more engaging and informative. The movie is a bit long and a bit slow, but hey, I'm no movie critic. If you look at the traces of PFAs around the country, you can see at various industrial sites there are PFAs detected, even in Connecticut, near us, Long Island, Connecticut, or California, all over the place. And more than close to half of all industrial sites, they find at least 1% of PFAs contaminating the area, right? Which is not good. Again, very widespread. And part of the reason they're so widespread is because not only are they used in things like Teflon, but they're also used in packaging of food to help make it like water resistant or oil resistant. Think like the containers you get your fries in or cupcake wrappers. And those can leach PFAs into your food, which then you eat. But if these get thrown out, they can also end up in landfills. And if they're composted, they can end up in crops, which you eat, and ends up in your body. Or if it goes to a landfill, it can end up in the environment, possibly in a fish, which then you may eat and ends up in your body, right? We are top predators, so we are impacted substantially by biomagnification. So PFAS are something we really want to watch out for. Thankfully, the Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants was a 2004 international treaty designed to eliminate the use of POPs, including PFOAs, and all of the countries in green are the countries who signed the treaty. So which major countries have not signed the treaty? Yeah, you can see Italy hasn't signed the treaty, and the United States. The United States is one of the only countries here that isn't green, hasn't signed the treaty. So as Kermit the Frog says, or perhaps the United States, it's not easy being green. The last example of a POP that I want to talk about are PCBs. PCBs are an industrial coolant that are used widespread throughout various different industries, such as the manufacturing of transformers, which are these things on telephone poles. It is a carcinogen, which causes cancer. It was banned from being produced in 1978, but much of the PCBs that have been produced are still allowed to be used and still widely used today. Many sites that used PCBs, many industries that use PCBs are now Superfund sites as designated by CERCLA and are oftentimes releasing those PCBs into nearby ecosystems. One example is the PCB Superfund site in the Hudson River. And the PCBs play a really pivotal role in the history of environmental justice because of something that happened in North Carolina, which I've mentioned before. This is a little bit of a story. So let's start with something called the Midnight PCB Dumpings in 1978, which you can probably already tell doesn't sound so good. So basically, there was this company that manufactured these transformers here, and it was called Ward Transformer Company, run by Robert Ward and his associate Robert Burns. And they dumped 31,000 gallons of PCB-contaminated oil along 220 miles of highway in North Carolina. And they did this because they want to avoid the regulations imposed by the EPA and didn't want to have to pay to properly dispose of this material, because North Carolina didn't have a toxic waste site at this point, and disposal of this hazardous material safely was very expensive. So rather than pay, they just secretly dumped it on the side of the road in the middle of the night, which is obviously terrible. So Robert Ward went to prison for 2 years and paid a $200,000 fine, which may sound like a lot, but is actually not that much considering how much this whole movement is going to end up costing in the long run, as you'll see. And the site of this company was later classified as a Superfund cleanup site by the CERCLA Act. So some significant problems here. And these PCBs remained roadside. They just sat on the side of the road. Nothing was done about them for 4 years. There was a lot of community backlash about this. So the state of North Carolina designated a PCB landfill that you could see here in Warren County in 1982. So for 4 years, all this waste sat on the sides of highways, and then they finally decided, okay, let's build a landfill. They built it in Warren County, or they planned it in Warren County, which is 65% black and was one of the poorest counties in the state with 25% of people in poverty. And they built a dry tomb disposal for 60,000 tons of PCB-contaminated soil. And this dump was commissioned by the Toxic Substances Control Act, which is different than CERCLA in that it doesn't allow for any community engagement in the decision. So the community doesn't get any input in whether or not this site is a good idea. And of course, you can imagine that there was a lot of pushback on this site because of the dangerous health effects of PCBs. And on top of that, this site was predicted to fail at the time because A, it was built within 7 feet of the groundwater underneath. There were system systems designed to collect leachate. So any water that flows through this toxic waste will pick up that toxic waste, and it can leave the dump and contaminate surrounding ecosystems. That contaminated water is called leachate. And so they planned collection systems for this leachate, but they never actually built them. And the soil is extremely permeable in this area, which puts the groundwater and surrounding soil at high risk. So, as you can imagine, there was a lot of pushback from the community and some pretty substantial protests. There were, in the 1982, 6 weeks of multiracial nonviolent protests. So white, black, and indigenous American citizens from this county showed up, organized by the NAACP and various churches in the area, lasted 6 weeks, with community leaders, citizens, and even a congressman from the area showing up to protest. 500 protesters were arrested over the span of the 6 weeks, despite it being totally nonviolent. And this actually was the moment that sparked the environmental justice movement, crossing the streams between civil rights and environmental rights, creating environmental justice. This is the founding moment for that whole movement, because these protesters asserted that their community was targeted for the dump site, not because it was ideal, as we've already established, but due to the fact that it was predominantly black and they didn't have a lot of financial power and a lot of political power to push back. So they protested as a result. And although they initiated the environmental justice movement, unfortunately failed to stop the construction and implementation of this landfill. The landfill, you can see here some protesters lying down to stop the trucks from driving in. The landfill, each year, they measured that about 30,000 gallons of water from rain flowed into the dump and about 26,000 gallons of then contaminated water flowed out into the surrounding land and water. These PCBs leached into the groundwater. They escaped into the air through toxic gas. Eventually, the community was awarded $1 million, but for tens of thousands of individuals, $1 million is split amongst them is not very much, right? That's like maybe, I don't know, $10, $15 per person. And they started cleanup in 1993, over 11 years after the protests, and the completion of the cleanup wasn't completed until 2004. So close to over 22 years since the initial protests, this dump had remained a massive risk for this community. And this cleanup cost $13.6 million, whereas if the company that was responsible for this whole thing, the Ward Transformer Company, if they had properly disposed of their waste in the first place, A, it wouldn't have cost that much, and B, the taxpayers wouldn't have paid for it because it was the company's responsibility to pay for. So that's the story of Warren County landfill with PCBs. It is the founding moment for environmental justice in the United States, and is a great case study looking at how science intersects with society, and how if you collectively engage as community members and speak up, doesn't matter if you're a child or you're an adult, you can take a stand for what you believe in and protecting your community. That's all I've got for you today. I will bring your questions to class, and I will see you then. Take care.